Welcome back. Let's turn to the question of these federal electric vehicle mandates and how they're affecting the politics of the state of Michigan. Let's start with a clip of a debate recently between Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin on WXYZ TV.
5,000 auto dealers wrote an open letter to the Biden administration and said, "You are killing the car business. Please stop with the EV mandates." And so if you think about what's happening, they mandated you have to drive that car. And my opponent signs an NDA that allows a Chinese battery company to go to outside of Goshen in order to facilitate her votes on EV mandates. Same with the $500 million rebuild at the GM factory. You're promoting Chinese technology in America. It's wrong. Let's go to hybrids. People are buying them. You don't have to mandate that they drive them.
Mr. Rogers, thank you. 30 seconds rebuttal, Ms. Lockout.
Again, there is no EV mandate. I don't care what you want to drive. It does not matter to me. But I don't understand the position of my opponent who says he cares about American manufacturing, but doesn't want to compete against China. We all learned in COVID. For those of us who were here in Michigan during COVID, we all know that we learned our lesson that we had outsourced too far to China, our supply chains. We made a decision to bring them back. I want that manufacturing here. I don't care what you drive. I want to build them.
This is also playing in the presidential race. A Trump campaign ad running in Michigan says, "Attention auto workers. Kamala Harris wants to end all gas-powered cars." Says Michigan auto workers are paying the price. Kamala Harris responded recently in a rally in Flint, Michigan. She said, "I will never tell you what kind of car you have to drive, but here's what I will do. I will invest in communities like Flint. We will retool existing factories, hire locally, and work with unions to create good-paying jobs." Unquote. Alicia, can you give us a refresher? What do these federal EV rules actually do, and how are they playing out on the ground nationally as well as in Michigan among these automakers?
So these rules are promulgated by the EPA, and they're greenhouse gas emission standards. Now, I will caveat all this by saying it's not even clear whether the EPA has the authority to set greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles. That is actually an open question, and if greenhouse gases emissions are actually pollutants under the Clean Air Act. But in any case, what the administration has done is use these greenhouse gas emission standards to de facto mandate that automakers produce more and more electric vehicles because that's the only way that they can meet these standards. And so if you actually look at the EPA's own models, its rule would require that plug-in hybrids, these aren't regular hybrids, they're actually plug-ins, or battery-powered cars make up 32% of automaker sales in 2027. And these are based on the automaker, so not net total. So 32% of Ford's vehicle sales in 2027 will have to be plug-in hybrids or battery-powered EVs. By the time you get to 2032, basically 70% will have to be plug-ins or battery-powered. A small share can be hybrids. So this, in effect, is a mandate because once you're requiring these automakers to produce these cars, there will basically be no other choices. On dealer lots, there will only be, by 2032, say, 2 electric cars for every gas-powered model. That means what's going to happen? Supply and demand. Prices are going to go up for gas-powered cars because there's going to be restricted supply. You may actually see, and we've been seeing, prices come down for electric cars because they're just sitting on dealer lots. I think there is some estimate that they're on average time on the dealer lots is about 90 to 100 days versus about 60 to 70 for gas-powered cars. And that's because manufacturers are producing more and more of these EVs to satisfy both the federal mandates and actually a California mandate, which is even more stringent. And California, note, has decided to ban all gas-powered cars by 2035, and about a dozen states have decided to follow its mandate.
To underline those numbers that you're talking about, Alicia, by 2027, 3 years from now, battery-powered and plug-in hybrid cars have to be about a third of automaker sales. And then it's something like 70% by 2032, which is just around the corner in regulatory and economic terms. And part of what I think is interesting about what's going on here is it's kind of a semantic dodge. So the statement from Kamala Harris is, I will never tell you what kind of car you have to drive. And Alicia, in some sense, that's true. This is not a mandate on consumers on what kind of cars they can buy. It's a mandate on automakers and auto dealers what kind of cars they can sell. Alyssa Slotkin making the same sort of argument. But I don't know how much water that holds if the ultimate result is basically the same, that consumers who are going to the auto lots looking for their next car are facing a restricted set of choices compared with what is on there now or what they experienced the last time they were on the lots.
Right. So if you recall Henry Ford's, the famous quote, you can have any car Model T you want as long as it's black. Well, you can have any vehicle you want as long as it's going to be electric. Right. And so that's what's going to happen is you just have fewer and fewer choices. And by the way, if you look at trucks, the rules are actually much more stringent for trucks. So by 2027, they're only going to be, at least under the Biden rules, the car makers would have to produce 2 electric trucks for every 1 gas-powered. And by 2032, the ratios actually has to be closer to 4-1. And the trucks and SUVs are actually the profit centers for these automakers. That's how they actually are financing the electric vehicle transition. So they're pumping billions of dollars. That money is coming from profits on their gas-powered trucks. The problem they're going to run into, and they're starting to, actually, if you see the issues going on with Stellantis right now, is that as they produce more electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, their profits are shrinking. And so they actually can't finance that transition. So the margins are shrinking. They're having to lay off workers. And there are other reasons we can get into why they're having to lay off workers. But this is actually creating quite a squeeze for the automakers.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break.
Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker. Play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Nick, in the Senate race, one of the arguments, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't there a recent vote at a Congressional Review Act resolution to overturn these EPA rules? And what did Alyssa Slotkin do?
She voted against the Congressional Review Act resolution to repeal the agency's emission standards. And interestingly, after a debate in Grand Rapids, Mike Rogers told me, quote, the only reason they did that, saying of the Slotkin campaign ad, is because they don't think we have enough money to come back and say that's wrong. Unfortunately for Mike Rogers, he might be right that he doesn't have enough money actually in the home stretch to prove that she's wrong. He's being outspent about 5-1. And interestingly for him, as the Senate Leadership Fund, a super PAC, has infused about $22 million to help him broadcast his message online, the race has tightened for weeks. It was about 4 to 5 points of a deficit for Rogers. Now it's about 2 on average. And the question will be whether he can effectively prosecute the case that she's for what she says she's against.
But what a tension, Alicia, within the Democratic coalition. On one side, you have Green voters, environmentalist voters who like these kinds of mandates, who are extremely worried about climate change and think that we need to accelerate hybrid and EV rollouts as fast as the federal government can possibly do it. On the other side, you have not only the consumers that we've been talking about, the people who maybe don't want an EV, it doesn't work for their situation. They live on a dirt road, as Alyssa Slotkin says she does, far from an EV charger. They live in a northern area. They're concerned about the battery life and the range. Not only those voters, which I think is a pretty good chunk of the electorate, but also the people working at these auto plants, the people working at the parts manufacturers that are supplying the auto plants, and the union workers. Union labor in Michigan is a pretty significant electoral force, it seems to me, and difficult if she is getting on the wrong side of that, potentially, with some of these voters. And just a reminder of the narrowness of the margins. As Nick said, the latest Real Clear Politics average has Slotkin up by 2 points. And that's a little bit different than in the presidential race where Trump is up by 0.9. So part of the difficulty for Rogers is closing that gap. But in an era where split ticket voters are few and far between, part of the outcome in the Senate race may come down to how the presidential race turns out and whether Trump is able to win Michigan, first of all, and win it with enough voters that even if Rogers is running a little bit behind, he can get over that finish line. And Alicia, at this point, much like the broader political story, it looks close to a toss-up.
Right. And I think the reality is on Trump and Rogers' side in that if you look at Michigan, I did analysis, 9,500 auto parts jobs have been lost in the last 5 years. And much of that is because actually of the EV transition. And a lot of those jobs have actually been lost at the parts suppliers because EVs require many fewer parts. In fact, the United Auto Workers back in 2019 projected that the EV mandates that were actually being considered then, or not by the Trump administration, but just the EV investments that some of the automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis were making, and the California mandates. The UAW projected that those would cost it about 35,000 jobs in the next few years. And you are actually seeing that. And most of those jobs, again, are at the auto suppliers. Now, there are some EV investments being made due to the Inflation Reduction Act. I hate using that word name, or it's a misnomer. But those are mostly flowing to states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia. And it's not even sure if those will pan out. You've seen some EV startups actually file for bankruptcy. And so the story has not finished yet. But you are seeing in Michigan job losses. Both Granholm, the former Michigan governor, now the energy secretary, likes to tout all these grants that are going to automakers to retool factories, including about $500 million for a factory in Lansing to produce EVs. Well, the interesting thing is if you do a breakdown, that's about $800,000 to save one job. You're saving a job that you wouldn't need to save if you weren't mandating these cars. And actually, GM has announced that it's actually delaying production of the EV that was set to make at this new retooled factory by about a year. No doubt it's also trying to hedge to figure out, well, if Trump wins, well, maybe it won't have to do this after all. Maybe it'll actually rejigger its production plans. And there's actually enormous uncertainty, and that is actually costing jobs and investment. And you're seeing that in Michigan, and that's spreading through word of mouth. I mean, I've actually just read it in some news reports, workers saying, oh yeah, I have some friends who've been laid off at parts manufacturers. And I think that message is getting out and resonating is why you're seeing the gap in Michigan close between Rogers and Slotkin and Trump and Harris. And I'd also point out it's not just the EV mandate. If you look, there was a recent poll, a Quinnipiac poll last week that showed overwhelming opposition in Michigan against even EV subsidies and incentives to buy EVs. And independents opposed EV subsidies 57%. So government intervention in trying to force feed these EVs on the public, it's just not popular.
Thank you, Alicia and Nick. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.